Today, I am going to explain a drama, mystery movie called Rebecca. Please be aware, the video contains spoilers. The movie begins with a narrator, telling her latest dream about Manderley, an estate, owned by Maxim de Winter. She implies that this is a reoccurring dream, and explains that where her driveway once stood, now is a dark and tortured jungle. Nature claimed it, and yet, the house still stood. She recalls one of her memories, a memory, when she was still just a girl starting a career in Monte Carlo. She arrives to her new workplace to a monumental hotel, where she passes through a wedding that's being held there. The whole place is crowded with celebrating folks. She passes by them, going for the elevator. We hear her voice from the present, wondering what her life would have been without Mrs. Edie Van Hopper, or without that job. She then continues and says that if it wasn't for them, she would have never gone to Manderley or met her husband. She arrives at the top floor, and goes to Mrs. Edie Van Hopper's residence. The flat is extremely fancy in style, and even has a sea view. She brought packages for her from the post office, then has to get the table ready for lunch as they are expecting Maxim de Winter, who's still heartbroken from his wife's death. He has one of the finest properties in England, the Manderley. Van Hopper treats the girl harshly, calling her stupid, and urges her to get everything perfectly done for the lunch. Mrs. Van Hopper wants Mr. de Winter to sit next to her, as she would love to put her hands on the estate. The woman then goes to the lobby, trying to organize the seats as Mrs. Van Hopper wished. She even tries to bribe the host, but change falls out of her pockets, creating an uncomfortable attention. A gentleman in a suit helps her gather all her pennies, while telling her she shouldn't try so hard to get to Mr. de Winter, because he is a total bore. The host then calls out to Mr. de Winter, who happens to be this gentleman standing next to the narrator. She is now waiting for Mrs. Van Hopper to arrive at the lunch, while she's drawing sketches of ladies next to her. Mrs. Van Hopper arrives, acting like it's a total surprise for her to see Mr. de Winter there. She then invites him to their table, but Winter says he prefers to eat alone. Winter thinks the woman is a Van Hopper as well, but Mrs. Van Hopper makes sure he knows she's just staff. She sends her to fetch photographs of her nephew's engagement party, because Winter met the boy last summer and he might like to see them. So she goes out of the dining hall in shame, but goes back only much later. We see that at night, she's drawing in her bed, eavesdropping to Van Hopper talking to her friends and laughing at her. She's saying how she came back smelling like cheap rose water, because she lost her mind over the young bachelor. The women start to talk about Winter's dead wife, Rebecca. How much he adored her, and won't even want to look at another lady. The girl wakes up Van Hopper, who is feeling sick and vomits in a bucket. She calls the doctor, who orders the old lady to stay in bed. Later, she goes to have breakfast at the terrace, but the server tells her she can't eat or do anything at the hotel because she is only staff and not really Van Hopper's companion. Winter overhears the conversation and tells the server that she sits with him. They have breakfast together while they talk about Van Hopper's unbearable presence. But being a companion to her pays her very well, the girl says. They have a nice conversation, then walk away together. She thanks him for his kindness, then Winter says goodbye, leaving her disappointed he didn't ask her out. Later, she receives a letter from him, to come for a drive. She lies to Van Hopper where she's going, dresses up for the date and escapes. On their drive, they talk about the girl's dead parents. When they get so distracted, they almost crash. They go to a beautiful jungle site and hike up on the hill to a beautiful view of the sea. She wants to know if Winter has been here before, because he seems to know the place. He admits he has, years ago on his honeymoon with Rebecca. She wants to know how Rebecca died, but Winter doesn't want to talk about it. On the drive back, they talk about Manderley, how it has been passed from father to son for centuries. Until now, because he has no heir, explaining her that his sister's boys will get it if he dies, which bothers him, because they are not truly de Winters. They get back by night. The girl, while getting out of the car, finds a love poetry collection, addressed to Maxim de Winter, from Rebecca. Winter sees this and tells her to put it back. Van Hopper is still in bed by the time she gets back. She's eating herself up, because of touching Winter's personal book. The next morning, she receives another note from Winter, inviting her to lunch. They actually end up going on a lot of dates together after this. Everything is going well, they connect and have deep, personal conversations. She wishes to never forget this week they spent together. They spend a lovely day at a remote beach swimming and doing adult stuff. The girl gets home, seeing Edie Van Hopper is already feeling better and dismissed her nurse. Edie is going to dinner alone, and asks the girl to book the early train home for tomorrow morning. They are going to New York. She wants to punish her with this, because she knows about Winter and her. She goes to Winter to say goodbye. He doesn't want her to go, so he asks her to be his wife and go to Manderley with him. They go to Van Hopper to tell her about the marriage. Edie acts excited and all happy for them, and really wants to be at the wedding. They will be wed there at the hotel, they say. The girl and Van Hopper end up having a conversation alone, where Hopper says Rebecca's ghost is still in Manderley and Winter just doesn't want to live with it alone anymore. Future Mrs. De Winter says she doesn't believe in ghosts, then leaves. They get to the huge Manderley estate, where the staff is already waiting for them. Inside the huge home, Mrs. Danvers welcomes them. She runs the house. She gets introduced to the staff, and her husband has to leave for office matters, so Mrs. Danvers shows her around. Danvers explains the Winter family line's origins. Danvers says they thought Mrs. De Winter was a maid herself when she met Maxim, as the staff don't think highly of her. They are very cold towards Mrs. De Winter. She can't even have Rebecca's huge room. She has to sleep in a guest room. Rebecca's soul still haunts the place. The staff tell her how the house used to be a place of happiness and balls back when Rebecca was still alive. Mrs. Winter now has to live up to a ghost. The freshly wed couple has a conversation about secrets. Mrs. Winter now really wants to know what really happened to Rebecca, who she really was. How is Max's feelings about her? But Max tells her nothing. She even has dreams about seeing Rebecca walking around, and she also hears loud screams, waking her up constantly. On night, she wakes up to her husband missing from next to her. She goes out to the hallway to find Max aimlessly walking around the huge house. She follows him. He stops, and she tries to reach for his shoulder, but Mrs. Danvers's voice breaks the silence, telling her it's dangerous to wake a sleepwalker. We see a huge breakfast being prepared by the staff. Winter has already eaten, and when his wife asks if he knows that he sleepwalks, he just leaves her there. He seems to have a lot of secrets. Later, Mrs. Winter is wandering around the house. When she hears the dogs barking at a door, they wanted to get in, so she lets them. It seems like it used to be the morning room. She goes through the drawers and Rebecca's fashion papers are there, marking how she must have been dressing. She accidentally breaks a little ceramic figure. She cleans it up, she hides the broken pieces, but she cuts herself in the process. She later goes to look for her husband, but she can't find him. She tries to ask maids in the kitchen if they have seen him. Then Mrs. Danvers comes up to her to ask about the menu for the day, and compares Mrs. Winter to Rebecca again, saying how particular she was about food, when current Mrs. Winter just says yes to everything. Then she says she'd like whatever Rebecca would have had. At night, Mrs. De Winter is brushing her hair, when she notices that an R is carved into it. There are still some black hairs in it along with her blonde. This ominous R is carved in or written on everything Rebecca owned. One day, husband and wife have a stroll around the beach. When the dog Jasper runs away, Mrs. Winter goes after him, which makes Max very nervous. Following Jasper, he leads Mrs. Winter to an abandoned beach house. She can hear Jasper growl at something behind the curtains. She tries to tie him up, but he just barks. Jasper goes behind the curtains, and she finds a man who owns the keys for this cottage. He tells her this is not her dog to take away, because he belongs to Rebecca. He says she doesn't come here anymore because she drowned, and he tells her she really isn't like Rebecca. Max still doesn't want to talk to her new wife about the late Mrs. De Winter. We see Mrs. Winter show honeymoon pictures to Max's sister and granny. They offer to teach her riding, so she could go hunting with them, but Mrs. De Winter says she might want to hold balls again, just like Rebecca used to. The sister and friends are supportive, but Max is not happy about it. The granny asks Mrs. De Winters if she's staying at Manderley, because she certainly isn't the wife of her grandson. She laughs, grabs and squeezes her hand, asks who is this child, and what has she done to Rebecca. They quickly take the old lady home. The sister explains that Rebecca was just one of those annoying people who mesmerized everybody, with who, they mortal women just can't compete. Later, the staff and Mr. Winter are having a conversation about a missing ceramic, then Mrs. De Winter walks in. They think Robert took it. It was an extremely valuable piece. Mrs. De Winter admits she accidentally broke it, but they want the broken pieces back. The next morning, the new wife goes back to the cottage on the beach, unrevealing the old furniture and some old photographs, but Max's assistant, Frank, walks in on her. She says it's a shame this place is going to ruins, but Frank tells her to get out and locks it, as Max asked him to do before he left to London. Mrs. Winter is surprised, as she didn't even know about her husband leaving to London. He then tells her that now they have no boat, so there is no reason to use the house anymore, but also, the reason why they don't have a boat, is because it went down in the sea, while Rebecca was on it. Rebecca's body was only recovered 2 months later. She asks him if Rebecca was beautiful or not, and Frank tells her Rebecca was the most beautiful creature he has ever seen. Mrs. De Winter goes to Rebecca's old room, then Mrs. Danvers appears out of nowhere again. She shows Mrs. De Winter the nightgown she was supposed to wear the night she died, and tells her about how gorgeous she was, how she used to brush her hair, and how Max and Rebecca were always happy and laughing. The wife is furious. She doesn't understand why they keep the room so untouched. Then Danvers tells her it's because Rebecca is still there with them. Danvers tells her she wonders what Rebecca thinks of the new Mrs. Winter taking her husband and using her name. Mrs. Winters tells her Rebecca wants Maxim to be happy, but she replies with, "Maxim will never be happy again." Mrs. De Winters has nightmares about Rebecca again, and sees Max walk away from her, but when she tries to go after him, the house drags her down with vines leeching onto her. The next morning, once again she's trying to catch Jasper, when at the front of the house she meets Jack Farewell. He came to see Mrs. Danvers for tea. He suddenly runs away, when hears a horse neighing. He calms the horse down, saying only Rebecca could sit on him or keep him calm. He asks if she knows about the accident, because before Rebecca died, she wanted to tell him something, and maybe Max would know what it was. The missus tells him to ask Max himself, but he informs her that he is not welcomed here. He leaves and Mrs. Winter goes to Danvers asking why she invited someone Max clearly banned from the property, but she tells her she knows nothing. When Max comes back, they tell him Jack was here, and Max accuses Mrs. De Winter with cheating on him with Jack, as he doesn't believe Danvers invited the man. Mrs. De Winter goes to Mrs. Danvers, who tells her she used to look after Rebecca when she was little. The wife wants her to leave, but she says she can't, because Rebecca was her life. Danvers offers help for the wife. Later Max apologizes to his wife for the accusations. Things seem to be going well. They even start organizing the ball. Mrs. Winter had problems with choosing the right dress, but Danvers and the maid helped her. She chose a red gown, inspired by one of the paintings in the hallway as her costume. It's the day of the costume ball. They are waiting for Mrs. De Winter only. She arrives in her red gown, with darkened hair. Max and the guests are shocked. They think it's some kind of joke. Max tells her to change immediately. She rushes crying into her room, where the maid tells her it was Mrs. Danvers' idea to make her wear what Rebecca wore on the last ball. Max's sister goes after her and helps her to change. She then goes downstairs. Max tells her everything was a mistake and he should have never brought her here. She wanders around the people, when she suddenly sees the same figure she saw in her dreams as Rebecca. She starts to follow the lady in the red dress. She ends up in Rebecca's room. Danvers is also there. She tells Mrs. De Winter she will never replace Rebecca, and how Max will never love her, and how she will have nobody if Max leaves her. Danvers says no one wants her here, but she shouldn't worry, it'll all be very quick, implying that she should just kill herself. They hear people screaming and making a big fuss. From the room's window, they see everybody from the ball run to the shore, so Mrs. Winter and Danvers goes along. The sun is already coming up. There are divers in the water as they found the boat that sank with Rebecca. They found a body. They say it's Rebecca, but they don't understand how could that be. They think they might have buried the wrong body before. At night, Mrs. De Winter goes to the beach house to find Maxim there. He says it's over, she's won, Rebecca won. Mrs. Winter doesn't understand this. He says Rebecca didn't drown, she was already dead, and he himself damaged the boat and sank it with her on board. He says nobody really knew her, how she really just had a parade of man and how she wasn't a good wife. She was in fact incredibly cruel to people. He truly hated her, but couldn't leave her as he had to keep the good name of the family. He says he was a coward. She was pregnant when she came back from London, and she told him he could never prove the kid was not his. She wanted to take away all his pride, along with his wealth and estate. Rebecca held a gun, which she then gave to her husband. She told Max to pull the trigger and he'll be free from her once and for all. Max pulled the trigger, killing Rebecca. Now, he asks the same from Mrs. Winter, as he thinks he can't get away with the investigation. He says Mrs. De Winter can tell the police and he understands if she wants to leave. But she doesn't. She says Rebecca didn't win after all, and they can get away with the court hearing. We see the couple go to the courtroom, making their way through journalists, to get to the trial. They know Mr. De Winter had something to do with the death. They think it was either suicide or unlawful killing. When they get home from the court, Jack is waiting there for them. He says to Max he knows he killed her and has a letter from Rebecca, explaining how she wanted to speak to him the day of her death, which would make it obvious Max is guilty, because why would someone invite somebody over, when they want to end it all? We also get to know that Rebecca was Jack's mistress and cousin at the same time. Mrs. De Winter thinks they can pay him in order to not to speak about the letter. At the court, it's time for Mrs. Danvers to speak. She reveals she knew about Jack's and Rebecca's affair. She tells the court about the note Rebecca left for Jack. She then proceeds to tell them about the money they offered Jack to not speak. Danvers tells the court she thinks Rebecca was pregnant. They arrest Winter. Back at Manderley, Mrs. De Winter, Frank and Mrs. Danvers get into a fight. Danvers says Rebecca despised them all the man and the people at the parties. Mrs. Winter tells her she's fired, and has to be gone by nightfall. Mrs. Winter goes to see Rebecca's doctor, who handled her pregnancy to steal her files. She manages to get them before the police could get their hands on them. From the notes, she finds out that she actually had uterine sarcoma and was not pregnant. The police talks to the doctor who says he does believe she committed suicide, because she had only weeks left to live. So they set Max free. Max and his wife are finally reunited and back at Manderley. But by the time they get back, it has gone up in flames. Mrs. Danvers set it on fire. The maid says Danvers went to the boathouse, so Mrs. De Winter runs after her, while Maxim watches his precious estate burn to dust. The beach house is now also on fire. Mrs. Danvers is standing on the edge of a cliff. She says to Mrs. De Winter she couldn't let anyone else, but Rebecca to have Manderley, then jumps off the cliff. We now see Mrs. De Winter wake up, saying she dreamt of Manderley again. But this morning, she left the dead behind.